Just wanted to greet everyone tonight. It's great to see such a full house for such an incredibly important topic. My name is Sarah Bartlett, and I'm the dean here at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. And we are the only public graduate school of journalism in the entire Northeast. And we're very fortunate that Marjorie Miller, who is the person who really ran this project and helped organize tonight's event, is on the board of the foundation of the school. So we have a close relationship with the AP. Our students love getting summer internships and jobs there after they leave here. And so when this first came up as a possibility, we were just thrilled to be able to be the host. And as someone who's had a little bit of time with the photos outside and some of the captions, I can just tell this is going to be a pretty amazing evening. So with no further ado, I'd like Marjorie to come up to the front. Thank you for coming.
So thank you, Sarah and CUNY and Geraldine and everyone who made this evening possible. We really appreciate it. Thanks to the IWMF, which supported some of the photography out there, and the photo essay project by Mei Yi Wang and Juliet Linderman. And if you haven't had time to look, those are the ones on the right. And we also have photographs by David Goldman on the left, part of our project. Thank you to all of our esteemed panelists for agreeing to do this. This came out of a project that the AP has been doing all year called The Reckoning, which is a sweeping, comprehensive look at what the Catholic Church has and has not done since 2002, when the crisis of clergy sexual abuse broke open. And it was born of a confluence of events. First of all, the diocese last year began releasing lists of credibly accused priests. I mean, they'd done some before, but thousands of them came out last year and this year. And a team of ours led by Claudia Lauer, who is here tonight, and Megan Hoyer decided to look at where they all are now. And what they found was pretty astonishing, that the vast majority of the 1,700 that they were able to find were, and who were still alive, were living unsupervised either by the church or by any law enforcement, and that many of them were in positions near, working with or living near at-risk people and young people. Very few had ever been criminally accused or prosecuted or on any sex offender list. And scores had licenses to work in schools, medical facilities, as counselors, and basically putting themselves in positions where they could abuse again. Thanks to Nicole Winfield and her amazing coverage of the Vatican, we were given access to troves of legal documents, many of them previously secret, and the personal records of a woman who had had an intimate relationship with her priest under the nose of the then president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Cardinal Daniel DiNardo. One of the stories that came out of the documents was a decision that we made to look at review boards, which were set up at the time in 2002 to, and some of them before, but in mass, to ensure that sexual abuse allegations were treated seriously and fairly, and that abusive priests didn't remain at work in ministry. And reporters Reese Dunklin, Matt Sedensky, who's here tonight, and Mitch Weiss looked at all of the review boards in the country, and what they found was that they had broadly failed. Instead of fulfilling these commitments, the review boards, which were appointed by the bishops, had operated in secret. They routinely undermined sex abuse claims and the victims. They shielded accused priests, and they helped the church avoid payouts. The third thing that happened was our good luck in that we were able to hire Mike Resendez of Boston Spotlight. And Mike brought to us really an incredible background and understanding of the issues, and has contributed mightily to this project, as have a score of other reporters and editors and photographers and videographers. So we hope that you will visit the Reckoning Hub, where we have all of our work this year on AP, on the app or apnews.com. And you can see the latest story, which ran yesterday, I think it was, by Bernard Condon, Jim Moustian, on the new wave of lawsuits facing the church as the states have suspended statute of limitations. And we're looking at possibly another 5,000 suits and potentially payouts of $4 billion. So the work continues, and I hope the conversation around this work continues. That's what this event is tonight, that we want to engage all of you. This is being live streamed on Facebook. We'll take questions. But we want to keep the conversation going as well as the journalism. So with that, I want to turn over the microphone to our very knowledgeable moderator, David Gibson, who is a former journalist with Religion News Service and Vatican Radio, and is director of Fordham University's Center on Religion and Culture. And we're very happy to have you tonight, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie, very much for organizing this. Again, thank you, Sarah, and for hosting this. I'm really privileged to be here and to be asked to help moderate this panel, to be the piano player effectively. And I really want to, again, thank you and offer my praise to the Associated Press for the kind of journalism they're doing and for the effort, for the resources that they're putting towards this kind of investigative journalism at a time when those resources are incredibly under pressure and under stress. And we can't thank you enough for trying to do the kind of work that you are doing. I also like very much the title you've chosen for your series, The Reckoning. Up at Fordham at the Lincoln Center campus, where I direct this center, we had an event last spring with Father Hans Zollner from the Gregorian University, as Nicole knows, a Jesuit there, who's kind of the point person on some of the reform efforts on clergy abuse there, and also researchers from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Karen Terry and Maggie Smith, who did a presentation updating their research. And we chose for the title Reckoning and Reform. And that idea of reckoning, I think, is so critical because, you know, in the Catholic Church, for the forgiveness of sins, we believe we must confess our sins, do penance, and amend our lives. It's a threefold process, and the first part of that is confessing our sins and helping to uncover those sins. And you can't have reform, genuine reform, unless you reckon with the past. And that's really what we want to explore here this evening in our conversation. And we're so fortunate to have with us a tremendous panel of great experience and great expertise. Let me just introduce them briefly. Starting down at the end, we have Ed Meckman, who is an attorney with the Archdiocese of New York, Director of Public Policy there. He's also Director of the Safe Environment Office at the Archdiocese. Basically, he oversees their child protection programs. Next, we have Mike Resendez, now again with the AP, investigative reporter, but well known as part of the Pulitzer Prize winning Boston Globe Spotlight team, which made a decent little movie as well. Then we've got Robert Bennett, former federal prosecutor, well-known defense attorney down in Washington, who was also one of the founding members of the National Review Board back in 2002 that grew out of the Dallas Charter, which grew out of the revelations by the Boston Globe. So he's got a great historical knowledge here. Then we have Nicole Winfield, the Associated Press's ace Vatican correspondent, who's been just doing tremendous work in uncovering and covering this scandal. But also, the sex abuse crisis is not the only thing going on in the Catholic Church these days, if you haven't noticed. So having Nicole there is like having one person cover the Trump White House. She's the hardest working woman in this business. And finally, we have Juan Carlos Cruz, who's a Chilean-born survivor of clergy sex abuse and a great witness to surviving this kind of crisis and also to retaining one's faith in the Catholic Church. And he's a fairly regular visitor to the Casa Santa Marta in Rome to chat with Pope Francis. So he's got some good stories from the horse's mouth, as it were. So this is how it's going to go. We're going to I'm going to lead a discussion with our panelists for about 40 minutes or so. Then we want to open it up to your questions. So please come prepared with some. I hope our discussion prompts some good thoughts from you all. We're also streaming on Facebook Live. So please ask your questions in the form of a question. Keep it tight. We'll take some questions from our online audience as well. And please remember to silence your cell phones and put your phasers on stun. Now, I want to start, historically speaking, really. This crisis didn't start in 2002, but that's a good starting point given what the Boston Globe did and that whole explosion of the abuse crisis, which was famously proclaimed to be history after the reforms of 2002. But that clearly was a premature judgment on what happened. But I do want to start with Mike and with Bob Bennett and put the question to you, what has changed? What can we say has changed since 2002? Mike?
Well, there's a lot that's changed, and there's a few things that have stubbornly not changed. I think perhaps the most significant thing that's changed is we have the emergence of a global survivors network. I mean, I think it's safe to say there are literally tens of thousands of survivors and victims who previously were suffering in silence, some perhaps believing that they were somehow responsible for what had happened to them, who have been able to come forward and say, hey, look, this happened to me and it was wrong. And I think that might be the most significant change. The other thing is, that's changed is we've seen this scandal erupt in one country after another. This is not a phenomenon that is specific to the United States, as some people once said. This is not a phenomenon that's specific to developed European countries, as some people have said. We've learned this as the scandal erupts in country after country, and I'm thinking in particular of the revelations in Chile and in Argentina and also in Mexico. We now understand that this is a global problem. It's a problem wherever the Catholic Church has a presence. The other thing that's changed, and maybe this is the earliest change, you've heard about already the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People that the American bishops approved way back in 2002. I mean, I think this is, in a way, perhaps the most significant change that has been undertaken yet by the Catholic Church. I think some wonder why the Vatican doesn't adopt it on a global basis. And that brings me to the thing that really has not changed rather stubbornly. And I think that's the fact that the Vatican, unlike the American bishops, has yet to really come to grips with this problem.
Bob, what is your sense of looking past over these past, 17 years since you were first tasked with being on that National Review Board? What is your sense of what's changed or what has not changed?
Well, my sense, excuse me, of what's changed.
Yeah. Oops. Is that on?
My sense is that what's really changed is that law enforcement has gotten involved. That's number one. I remember growing up as a Catholic boy that the police didn't want to mess with the police, and the police were very forgiving of the church and the priests and whatever. But once law enforcement got involved, things changed. Also, you have reporting requirements. That is a big deal, and that has changed. A third thing is the wonderful work of people like Mike, who brought this to the attention of the people of the United States and indeed the world. People know about this crisis. The National Review Board was a powerful board. I've been on other boards, none as myself not counted, it was a powerful board. You had people like Leon Panetta, Judge Burke. I mean, and all of us went into this thinking that, well, maybe the press has exaggerated this. And every single one of us left saying, my God, this is the worst thing imaginable. So I think the involvement of the public is the biggest change, because it's an awful situation. And once people learned about it, and once prosecutors brought cases, and once judges heard the full story, it was going to improve. It had to improve.
Well, when you went in, when you were asked to join this thing, I was there in Dallas in 2002, and Frank Keating, the former Oklahoma governor, kind of a law and order guy, made his famous comment about comparing the bishops to the mafia, and he kind of, that didn't go down well, and he had to leave the board. I mean, did you feel that you had the free rein that you needed to really be a check on the bishops?
Well, no, we certainly didn't have the free rein, because our investigation, we were not permitted to investigate the bishops. We were investigating the others, and Keating's comment was not helpful to us because we didn't have subpoena power. So I remember trying to talk to one priest, and he said, wait a minute, I've been compared to a mafia don. Why should I talk to you? So Keating did not serve us well with that remark, in my opinion. So,
But you felt you were effective in the end. I mean, you commissioned the John Jay people, and
yes, I think we were enormously effective with the ammunition that we had, and we were dogged. I mean, I had to chase Cardinal Law all over to get him to agree to a deposition. And I ran into him at some Catholic gathering, and I said, I'm not going to stop. And then he subjected himself to a deposition, and similar things about Cardinal Egan. And so we didn't stop. We really, really pursued these folks.
what are the Ed? What do you think? You're at the New York Archdiocese. What are the remaining challenges? What have you not done well, if you want to go into mea culpa mode here? The New York Archdiocese, I think, has been more proactive in some ways and has not had some of the devastating, numbers of cases or claims against it. What have you done right, and what do you need to do still?
Well, I think one of the things that we've done right consistently since the beginning is we've been insistent on changing the corporate culture, so that child protection is a major priority at every level. So that takes a lot of persistence. You have to have a lot of energy. You have to be willing to break through inertia, and you have to be consistent. And as much as I know Mr. Bennett doesn't had bad experiences with Cardinal Egan, he actually was very forceful here in the Archdiocese and made it clear that this was not going to go away. There were a lot of people who used to say to us, well, when is this going to go away? And the answer was never. So one of the things I think we did right was we've changed the culture to the extent that right now we basically have almost a full generation of volunteers and teachers and priests and deacons who are post-scandal people, post-Dallas people. So this is part of the way that they are used to operating, and that's a big help, I think. What we haven't done right, a lot of things. I think that complacency is one of the major problems in any kind of operation like this. I think the Pennsylvania grand jury report and the Cardinal McCarrick thing woke us up again to the need to be consistent and not let this go. So I think that we really need, not just speaking about the Archdiocese, but I think this is across the country, we need to break out of a little bit of complacency that we've fallen under. Because I think a lot of people did believe that this was over and done with.
Just want to pick up Nicole and Juan Carlos. Mike mentioned the globalization, I think, of this crisis, which I do think is a hallmark. I mean, all those years when those Vatican officials were saying, "Oh, this is just an American
That's right.
problem,"
That's right.
and all the Americans.
We heard that over and over again. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just you guys, or it's just a Boston problem.
Right.
Which was not the case. But this globalization of it, how has the Vatican dealt with it, Nicole? And what have they done right, and what remains to be done?
I think the Vatican has obviously been behind the ball, but Ratzinger, so the former Pope Benedict XVI, was actually, he saw it. He was in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and he was seeing these cases coming in. And so in 2001, he was like, we're not doing this well. Bishops around, for the most part, in the Anglo-Saxon world, were not handling these cases the way they should be. So he passed a law. He got the Pope, John Paul, to agree to pass a law that centralized the processing of all the cases in the Vatican. And that was a universal law. That was not just designed for the English-speaking world. At that point, the cases were really only coming from the US, Australia, Ireland. But he's had the foresight that this was going to be a universal problem and that they needed to deal with it universally. So starting in 2001, it became something that the Vatican was going to get its hands in. It hasn't done it well. The office that handles these cases is, it's a very small office. It's not an office that is terribly transparent. It's the former Holy Office of the Inquisition, so it has kind of this mystique of secrecy about it. But it has now, the prophecy has been fulfilled. It is a global problem, and the cases are erupting globally. Chile last year, but we had, it exploded in Europe in 2010. We had a bunch of cases coming out of the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany. It's coming out in a big way in France now. South America, I mean, it's, and we're not just talking priests, we're talking the hierarchy. So Africa is starting, and Asia is there, but it's just not, it's not public yet. So we are nowhere near the end of this, and I think the Vatican knows that, and that the worst may still be yet to come.
Can they even begin, Juan Carlos, can they even begin to tackle this? I mean, you can have critiques of the Vatican, but it's a 1.2 billion member church and 2,000 people working in the Vatican. I mean, is this even, how can this be done? How is this even possible?
Yeah. Well, before I answer your question, I'm going to take 15 seconds. First of all, to thank all the survivors that are here amongst us, and some have spoken up, some might not. But know that you are not alone, that people, these days, if something has changed, is that people understand. When I spoke up, the cardinal said, he's gay. When he was 14, he must have liked it. So I don't think he's a victim. And that was in the biggest newspaper in Santiago, in Chile. That has changed a bit. Not everywhere, but it's changed. So if I always take advantage of these platforms that I'm lucky to be in to especially tell survivors, and through you, other survivors, that there's always someone who will understand you, who will lend you a hand, and won't think you're crazy. And so that has changed. It needs to change more, but it has. And second, it's very fitting and that we are in a journalism school, because if it wasn't for journalists, and that's why I want to thank the AP and all of you studying to be great journalists, if it wasn't for journalism, we would still be in the dark. If it wasn't for Nicole, in my own case, I wouldn't be here speaking to you. If it wasn't for AP that has this commitment to talk about this issue that is so painful and so horrific, and it's only the tip of the iceberg we're seeing. If it wasn't for organizations like AP, we would still be in the dark. And the last thing that I said to some people earlier, you talk about, this situation that happened, this bishop that covered up, this priest that abused, this, all these horrific things which you have to report. But at the same time, I want you to know that as journalists, as organizations like AP, and you as future journalists, you are saving lives. And, that gives a lot of meaning to your work. This is not, because, obviously you have to report, you have to talk about these things, but you are saving lives. Definitely mine. And I know many others. I've lost many, many friends who couldn't take it and have committed suicide. And that breaks my heart. And, I feel they're with me here, speaking to you right now in some way. But I just want you to think that your work, all this work that you do, is not in vain. And to your question, I feel, like I just said, it's the tip of the iceberg. It's just happening. Nicole just said it. Nicole has such a vision of the world. And I've been fortunate to go through many countries. I spoke 2 years ago in Poland. And you know how the church is such a conservative and has a grip on, and not so much any longer, but so we were organized something for survivors in Warsaw. It was like a dungeon, something really, so nobody would, and we thought nobody would come. And 100 survivors showed up, but scared to death that they were going to be followed and some retaliation against them. So this happens still. It's happening now. And we need to speak up and we need to keep talking.
You meet with Pope Francis. You know him. You've read him the Riot Act, I think, in person. Can he change this? What does it take? Does it take policies? Does it take a culture change?
Mm-hmm. So last year when in January, Nicole has been my angel because she's been reporting this and her colleagues, and so our story, not just mine, but our story in Chile came out thanks to Nicole's reporting and some others, but especially Nicole. And so last year in January 2018, the Pope visited Chile. A country that claimed before to be 94% Catholic and very, very conservative. However, nobody was on the streets because we had been talking for 8 years, exposing the truth, exposing cover-ups of bishops, exposing pedophile priests, exposing pedophile bishops, exposing pedophile cardinals. And people started believing us. And so but yet the Pope was completely misinformed because he knew the cardinal in Santiago. They were buddies from way back when. And of course he was going to believe his friend and these 3 guys that were creating this mess, who were probably communists, who were, against the church, enemies of the church. I pray the rosary every day, but yet I'm a communist enemy of the church. That's fine. I don't care.
Join the club.
Yeah. So, but I have to tell you, nobody was on the street. So he went back and, this was weird. And eventually, and the story's long, but I'll say it in 15 seconds, they sent an investigator who, Monsignor Jordi Bertomeu, and led by Monsignor Scicluna, and the truth was finally exposed. And they came to interview me here in New York. And then they interviewed 70 people in Chile who exposed the truth. The Pope finally believed us. He sent a letter to the world saying, I have committed a great sin, because he had called me a liar, said in front of the world. Imagine me watching TV and hearing the Pope saying, he's saying calumny, he's a liar. I called Nicole and I'm like, can you believe this? She was as shocked as I was. And so after that, I spent a week with him in Santa Marta explaining everything to him. I mean, I didn't mince words. I knew I was in front of the Pope, and trust me, I was quite intimidated when I saw him. I'm like, do I lay down as a Persian rug? What do I do? He's the Pope. But truly, I was, I didn't mince words. I said, this is my opportunity, and it's not just for me. I have this huge backpack of survivors that are all putting their hope in me. And not that I have a Messiah complex or like I'm going to save the world. I don't. But I did feel that I had this duty to do something about it. And I didn't mince words. And, a month later, he called the whole Bishops' Conference of Chile and told them, you all will resign. They all resigned, and they said they had, presented their resignation. No, he made them resign, and that's the thing. When they say something, we tell the truth, and they are exposed, and they hate us. But he's kicked out 9 more to come. But at the same time, there was this click with me, and for some reason, and I've been able to keep talking to him, and I do not mince words in front of him. Now, to your question, I thought the Pope could, with a stroke of a pen, change everything. It's not that way. And Nicole has really opened my eyes to that. It's not that way. But we're trying, maybe one by one, but we're trying, and it's never enough, and it's the tip of the iceberg, but we're trying.
Nicole, is there, in the Vatican, is there a resistance to that kind of, this openness?
Yeah, I mean, the Vatican is very much an Italian bureaucracy, and the Italian Church is light years behind the Americans. So, in the Vatican, what the U.S. bishops did in 2002 is considered the golden standard, to which no other bishops' conference, except maybe the Irish, has reached. And the Italian Church is, as behind as they could possibly be. Only this year, did they. That they're putting together a victim, a central place where victims can go to report abuse. So when you have a culture like that of the Italian Church running the Vatican, you're going to have, dicasteries and congregations that are headed by people who just don't get it in the same way that the American Church and American Catholics would expect. And as a result, you have the institution that is responsible. Even the goodwill of people like Pope Francis, even the goodwill of people like Archbishop Scicluna, who have known that this is a problem and who would want to go further, they bump up against people who might still be in denial, people who think that, we can't just laicize every priest who's an abuser because we're going to end up with no priests, or maybe it's better to keep them in ministry, out of ministry with children, but still in the priesthood, because then we can keep a better eye on them. So there are these very different kind of ideological and practical thinking that can sometimes put the brakes on any kind of reform. I think the Chilean experience was radical. I mean, it was the most radical thing that has ever happened, to get an entire bishops' conference to resign en masse, over sexual abuse. I think one thing that the Vatican, what Pope Francis has done right, he created a commission of experts to advise him on sexual abuse. It has failed in many ways, but one thing that they have gotten right is a realization that the way that they're going to turn the church around is not a top-down model, but a bottom-up. And so they realize that they have to change the culture of the church on the ground. So they are going out and doing the workshops, going to dioceses, bishops' conferences, religious orders around the world, holding educational workshops so that your priests, your nuns, your lay people who are working with kids, who are responsible for programming with young people, they get it. So that even if your hierarchy might still be completely not with the program, you've got the people who are actually on the ground with it. You've got a pope who's with it. You've got a hierarchy that may be with it sometimes. But they've realized that the top-down is not going to do it alone.
Juan Carlos.
I felt that when we were doing the investigations, first of all, we were not permitted to investigate the bishops. So that tells you something. But our interaction with bishops was they were generally arrogant. They didn't believe the problem was anywhere near what it was. And we found it very difficult to get help and cooperation. I went to the apostolic delegate and said that the board wanted to go to Rome and talk to, we didn't say the Pope, but to talk to the hierarchy. And that we thought that if we could talk to them, that we would really find out. And when I went over there with Justice Burke and a newspaper man named Bill Burley, he, who was on the board, we met with Cardinal Ratzinger for 2 hours. And you can't even get to see Ratzinger. And if you see him, it's for 2 minutes. He was like overcome and felt it was clear to us that he had been lied to by his bishops, and it was a much more serious problem. How I got to Cardinal Ratzinger is funny, if there can be anything funny in this terrible situation. The consulate said it was outside of his jurisdiction. So I said, well, Cardinal, look, I said, how can you say, sir, that this is outside your jurisdiction? This involves children. Well, I didn't even speak to him. I spoke to some aide of his. And he said the cardinal feels it's outside of his jurisdiction. So I did something unheard of, for which I got very criticized. I sent a fax. We didn't use emails quite like we do now. I sent a fax to Cardinal Ratzinger saying that members of the board would like to come see him. And he returned my fax with his own fax. He said, come on. And I was pretty soundly criticized by other hierarchy because you don't send faxes to the second most powerful man in the church. And I said, well, look, I'm a trial lawyer, and I know how to get people, and I'm going to do it. But I think it's going to take a long, long time, because these bishops, for the most part, don't really feel what has happened is so bad. And they've had lots of problems in the past, and they'll get by this too. But the fear of going to jail, the fear of being exposed in the newspapers, that's what has gotten us some movement. I had hierarchy tell me, well, it's not so bad. It's something like you said. Well, look, this person's been gay, so what was done to him really isn't so bad. And the one thing that just shocked the board, and these were people not easily shocked, I mean, very sophisticated people, was that we thought, there was one exception, and I'll tell you about him, that there's such an inconsistency between portraying yourself as a man of God and then molesting a child. But not so. I thought, you know, I feel guilty about everything.
Good Catholic. Yes.
Everything. I'm a good Catholic. Everything. But I would think that a priest who molests a child would feel pretty damn guilty, given he's wearing a collar or whatever. So,
Juan Carlos,
but they
you-
aren't. They aren't. They don't feel guilty for the most part.
What?
And, the one exception was Dr. Paul McCarrick, who was the head of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins.
Your mic.
I said that the one person who said, well, he wasn't surprised, it was Paul McCarrick, Paul McHugh, who was the head of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. And he said, no, he said, they don't think what they're doing is so bad, that sex is a part of life, and these priests are just helping these young people along on the road. So, you know, it was disheartening for me, very disheartening for me and the others.
Juan Carlos, you had a quick.
Yeah, one thing we've talked here that, you know, things have changed, and in the U.S. especially, and yes, we have, but there's this. We're a very polarized society. You're all journalists. You're all intelligent people. I don't need to tell you the type of world we're living in our society here in the United States, but also in general. There's this ultra-conservative faction in the church right now, which is very dangerous, and I like to speak, and you can quote me on this because I say it with names, and they can say whatever they want about me, but I want to expose them because we have a former nuncio here, Nuncio Vigano, who was the nuncio here in the United States. We have a man named Cardinal Burke. We have several other ultra-conservatives that are attacking Francis right now for the abuse cases. But what are they trying to do? They're just trying to pass their ultra-conservative agenda. So say Mass in Latin, kill all the gays, and let's move to the pre-Vatican Council II church. And then they weaponize victims, they weaponize survivors, and that is wrong. And we need to be alert to that and not let ourselves be caught up in those things. And the other thing, which I hear in the United States, especially in Latin America, in Europe, intelligent people, as you were saying, they the abuse cases that happened in the 80s and the 90s. I have these guys in Costa Rica recently. They went to the Archbishop now, and they had been abused in the 90s. And they tell him, you know, and this is many bishops, you know, we were abused, etc., horrible stories. And then the bishop says, you know, in the 80s, the 90s, we didn't have the protocols to deal with these issues. The other day I was at a panel and a big archbishop here, you know, bishops are, you know, a learning curve. Well, we can't wait for bishops to finish their learning curve. Raping a kid, raping a child, raping a girl, molesting a child, molesting a little girl, molesting a vulnerable person has been wrong before Christ, after Christ, in the Middle Ages, now, and it will always be wrong. So if you're not capable of understanding that and you have to wait for a protocol, I don't know what you're doing as a bishop. Please leave.
David. Absolutely, there's no excuse whatsoever for anybody minimizing the rape of a child. It's horrendous. But one of the things I think that is clear here, and it's very clear to me, I'm in the trenches in a local archdiocese, Rome is not going to solve our problems. They can do certain things that'll give us the tools, but the problem has to be solved at the diocesan level. The most important people in solving this problem are the bishop and the people around him, because those are the people he listens to, those are the people who are taking the complaints in and doing something about it. And that's the most important thing. If you have a climate in a diocese where the bishop minimizes the importance, or they're primarily in defensive, protect the church mode, the problem is not going to be solved. If you have a bishop and the people around him whose dedication is to getting to the truth of every allegation, making sure the innocent are acquitted and the guilty are held responsible, that's where the solution comes. And we still have a long way to go on that. Obviously, the AP reporting, I think, on the review boards shows that very clearly.
I just want to invoke a survivor, Marie Collins, who was on Pope Francis's first pontifical commission. She quit out of frustration. And she has a different view of the bottom-up approach. Marie thinks there is something called leadership, and there are some very simple things that the Vatican could do. And one is to have a clear global definition of what zero tolerance is. And another is to have a clear set of protocols that would be applied globally. And the third is to have some sanctions for bishops who fail to adhere to those protocols. That doesn't sound complicated, but I've talked to Marie about that, and that's just a different point of view about how to solve the crisis.
You also you folks have brought up a couple of really important points, but Ed, the other thing is, you're right about the local level having a good bishop. Of course, the Pope is the only one who can get rid of a bad bishop, as we may see tomorrow morning up in Buffalo. But also the other thing that, again, the AP and also CNN has covered, which sounds a bit inside baseball, but religious orders. It's not just about, what is a third of the priests in the United States
that's right.
are members of religious orders. You can have a good diocese, but a religious order is an international entity that can transfer people, across boundaries.
And I think that's one of the things that good journalism helps people understand, is that the religious orders operate as almost like this transnational entity, almost like the United Nations or something. They're present in a diocese, but the bishop has very limited authority over them. And they have the ability to move men around, and they have done that. They've hidden men in dioceses. We've had that experience where all of a sudden we found out there was a man who was about to be sentenced for sexual abuse in Maryland, and he was living next to one of our high schools in a religious order house, and we had no idea he was even there.
What the hell do you do? I mean, what does the cardinal do?
The cardinal calls the superior and says, get him the blank out of my diocese right away, and if you ever have anybody who has an allegation against them who comes into my diocese, you have to tell us.
One of the saddest things is the case of Cardinal McCarrick. And in the spirit of full disclosure, he was a very good friend of mine. And I believe it was Cardinal McCarrick who saw to it that I was on the review board. And he and I used to have lunch and talk about these issues. And you could have wiped me off the floor when it came out that he himself was involved. And the fact, I later learned, that many of the hierarchy knew about his activities, or at least many of his activities. And yet he was able to rise in the church to be cardinal. How does that happen? I mean, there was a lot of knowledge out there about that. I have since learned that certain heads of monasteries, when Cardinal McCarrick was coming to visit, they would get their good-looking young gentlemen who were studying for the priesthood and hide them from Cardinal McCarrick. I mean, just a tragic thing. And that's a question, I think, that has to be addressed. How can you become a cardinal when a substantial number of people in the church know about these kinds of misdeeds. It's a problem that has to be looked at, and I think many of the cardinals and bishops are scared to death that people are going to learn about them. And I think there's much more to it than...
Well, Nicole's going to get the scoop on the McCarrick report.
Nicole,
coming
you
out
gotta
of
go get to work here. You do a brilliant job, and I'm still heartsick, and I've had to wrestle with, is there anybody I can trust? Because I would constantly say to people, well, you know it's terrible, but at least we have the Cardinal McCarricks of the world, and then boom, this atomic bomb goes off in my life, and it's been very, I don't want to say I'm the victim, but I've been very, very upset about it.
Nicole.
If I may, I think, to me, the Cardinal McCarrick case is so much bigger than, we're all talking about the Pennsylvania grand jury report. Fine. Pennsylvania was a big deal, but it didn't tell us anything we didn't already know. We knew that priests raped children. We knew that bishops covered it up. The McCarrick story showed that the hierarchy had been completely immune from all these great reforms. It showed that the cover-up went to the height of the hierarchy in the Vatican. And it showed that being sexually active was actually okay. I think what the Vatican and the grand circles of Catholics in the U.S. knew was that Cardinal McCarrick was gay, sexually active with adult men. And apparently that was, you could turn a blind eye to that. And it was only when the New York City Archdiocese got, I believe through the compensation procedure, an allegation of someone who was a minor who said that McCarrick, when he was a priest in the New York City Archdiocese, had groped him. That then crossed the line where the procedures, as we now have them, kicked into gear. So it was merely the age of the person who was molested that what made the difference, because up until then we were dealing with adult seminarians, and therefore we're talking about homosexual tendencies as opposed to sexual abuse of a minor. And I think, though, what the McCarrick story has told us was that these adult seminarians are victims too. Just because they were of age, just because they were adults, does not mean that they were not victims of sexual abuse. Why? Because Cardinal McCarrick had power over them. He was their bishop. He was their superior. He had their lives and careers in his hands. And if they refused his advances, they might kiss their vocations goodbye. And I think that, to me, is why, on many levels, the McCarrick case is so important, because it showed the loopholes of the Dallas Charter, which had completely exempted the hierarchy from any checks and balances. And it has exposed that we're not just dealing with sexual abuse of minors, we're dealing with abuse of power, and adults can also be victims of this. And to me, that opens a whole new world here, because we also have nuns who have been sexually abused by priests. These are adults, not always, but sometimes. They are at the whim of their bishop, at the whims of the priests. And I think the McCarrick case has started that discussion and has forced a reckoning in the Vatican to not just turn a blind eye just because someone was above the age of consent, technically.
Yeah.
Nicole is talking about is so important. It raises the issue of clericalism, which the Pope talks about all the time, and sometimes people laugh at him and they don't really understand what he means. Clericalism is the idea that there is a separate standard for priests, that they're not held to the same standard that lay people are, and that my brother priests won't call me out for things that I'm doing wrong. And we'll wait and see what the McCarrick report or reports ultimately say, if they say anything. But it clearly exposed the problems of clericalism and that abuse of power that brings and a sense of impunity that it gives them. Yes, minors, seminarians, religious sisters, adults in spiritual direction. It happens. And that climate of impunity comes from the clericalism, the double standard that is not enforced.
One quick question before we flip it over to the audience. Regarding McCarrick, it brings up an issue which you all have covered. But this whole thing of laicizing, defrocking people, there's always this movement, kick these people out of the priesthood. Then you lose track of them. Here's Cardinal McCarrick, busted down from cardinal, busted down from bishop, laicized, living out on the plains of Kansas in a Franciscan friary. But he also could leave at any time. What is the answer here? I mean, what should you do with these men who, don't have a criminal record because you can't prosecute these things, but they've clearly been guilty of abuse? What should be done? Kick them out?
I think in the final years of the Benedict papacy and when Archbishop Scicluna was running the show at the Vatican, the knee-jerk reaction was laicize. Also, insurance policies wanted these guys out because they would then the diocese would no longer be liable. But there is also the compelling argument that once you put these guys out on the street, yes, you're no longer liable for them, but is society better served because they could then go get a job at a daycare center, at a kindergarten. As our colleagues Claudia and Megan reported, when you sever those ties, you can't expect the church to keep tabs on these guys. If Burger King fires someone because he's been sexually harassing someone, you can't expect Burger King to keep tabs on them. That's not realistic. So if the church laicizes, the guy's out. If law enforcement has decided not to prosecute, he's free. So there is a huge, a very well-founded argument in favor of keeping them in the priesthood under monitoring so that at least you can control these guys. You maintain responsibility for them. They're also, clothed, sheltered, and many people would complain that that's just a golden retirement, that these guys get to live out in a gorgeous monastery in the hills of Rome somewhere after having committed these horrible crimes when they should be doing hard time. But there are arguments in favor of both in the absence of a criminal prosecution, which often in the case of sexual abuse, you're beyond statute of limitations.
This is actually an area where some of the religious orders have been, they've been holding on to the offenders, haven't been kicking them completely out of the community, but have been putting them away in a place where they're not a danger to anyone, and they operate under safety plans. So basically there's someone there who monitors them, keeps them off the internet, keeps them away from minors, things like that. That's one option. Sometimes the priests are sentenced to what's called prayer and penance, and they're put away in a place and they're held on to. But it's a terrible dilemma, you're right.
Prayer and penitence doesn't really work. They don't pray, they don't do penitence, so they just keep preying on people. And the only thing I want to say is we get so caught up, and rightly so, because we have to, on the stories of these predators, on the bishops, on the biggest forgotten ones are the survivors. So I want to be an advocate for them, and I know all of you are. It's just that we're talking about the issue, that's this issue. But the biggest forgotten ones are the survivors. They are not a conduit to get a pedophile priest or catch someone. Lives have been broken, and as journalists, and you've done it, and your colleagues do it, and I hope all of you studying for to be journalists do that. Hear them, hear their stories, listen to them. It's incredible what that will do to take you to an even better story, and you on top of it will be healing people. And I also want to, there's so many organizations that can help you as journalists look for these stories, and where you can have such big resources. Like, for example, Bishop's Accountability, the website. There's survivors groups all over the world. And, you know, sometimes survivors are very angry, and you have to understand how angry they are, because everybody has their timing. Their lives have been destroyed. And so you have to understand that a survivor can be the most angry person in the world. You know, the time will come, hopefully, he or she will come back and hopefully get some peace. But we have to understand that in the survivors world, there's this whole gamut of people. I've been called by survivors that I have a Stockholm syndrome, you know, because I'm trying to heal this way. I've chosen to live my life this way and help survivors and have a foundation that helps survivors with friends. We all do what we can. But it's understandable. You'll find a whole array of different survivors around the world.
Oh, great. I'd like to open it up to questions from you all. Helena is going to go around with a microphone. Please put your question in the form of a question. Save the speeches for later. Please, down here, I think.
Hi, thank you so much for everything you said. I have a question. So I've spent some time in Canada, and in Canada, the priest abuse is tied to a lot of colonial processes, especially residential schools. And I believe here the boarding school system was also a way that those two things were tied. And I was looking at the photos in Guam, and I'm wondering if that was also a case. I don't know a lot about the history of Guam, but I also know that there's a history of colonization there. So I'm wondering, how much did you see those like cycles of abuse tie up with other sort of like colonial processes happening on the ground, and whether in the recognition, I believe that the Pope has spent some time in Canada recognizing that they were responsible to, and like in this colonial process too, not just the abuse of priests, but also like a system of genocide. So I'm wondering, how much did you see this happening, like those recognition being tied up, and yeah, do you see it like being neglected in some parts, recognized in other parts?
Nicole?
I think what we've seen around the world is anywhere where where the Catholic Church through colonialism maintained an incredible influence in society, that's where you're going to have clericalism exploding. So that's why what's happening in South America is gonna blow. It's already starting to blow. I mean, it was a continent that was colonized and remains very Catholic. And I think, as Ed said, and as the Pope says, where you have this clerical culture, you're going to have abuses of power. I'm not familiar with the Canadian case in particular, but the residential schools, absolutely. We've seen in Australia, for example, where they've done, this incredibly in-depth investigation across all institutions, so not just the Catholic Church, but all institutional schools and residential things, wherever you have closed societies, whether they're schools or churches, or that's ripe for abuses of power and ripe for sexual abuse. Guam was one of these very closed, uber-Catholic societies, where not only their geographic isolation, but a very tight-knit Catholic culture, where generation after generation, it just festered, and it never got out. And so when it exploded in a very big way. What they're dealing now with, hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits. You've got the Archbishop who was removed. But it seems like it repeats itself. Wherever you have a very closed clerical society, you're going to have these kinds of abuses happening.
And also, I think if you're talking about a colonial environment, wherever you have populations where people don't have much money, people are poor, people don't have much education, they're just much more vulnerable, and they're much more fearful of people who do have resources and are educated. And I'm thinking not so much of Canada, but perhaps Alaska, and where there was a great, horrific problem with the Jesuits who went up and worked with indigenous communities there.
It's that whole thing, you ship them out to
They ship them out to our countries. You know, they abuse in Ireland, they abuse in Germany, they abuse in Spain. They end up in Chile abusing us, and so it is what Mike says is very true. Where there's some of the cases we've seen in Chile, especially, we've seen it from the whatever high class, if you will, to the poorer classes. But in the poorer classes, there's tons of victims that were abused by the priest, and they would threaten the kid, saying, "Don't say anything because your mom works as a cook in the parish and she's going to lose her." And there's many like that. And we see 800 cases a year in our foundation, and many are those same stories. So you're absolutely right.
I had this conversation with Mike earlier today. It seems to be the core of this problem, which kind of goes unsaid, is the celibacy requirement for priests. And is there any serious talk of lifting the celibacy requirements?
Well, let me just make a few observations. I don't know if there's any active plan to lift celibacy, but that's an issue we looked at. It's a very complicated issue. There are many celibate priests who wouldn't dream in a million years of taking advantage of a young person. They're some of the best priests we have. The same is true, as you know, there are a tremendous number of homosexual-oriented men in the clergy. I've heard it from 45% to 52 or 3%. They don't necessarily go out and molest somebody. So it's a pretty complicated a business. And celibacy, I had a friend who was a very active homosexual in Washington, D.C., and he's authorized me to use his name, David Mixner. And he said that he always felt that the church, he said his group, he was in the seminary at one point, I believe. But he said the church was a safe place because he never had to explain why you weren't married. And if you got caught doing something, the church protected you. So, I personally, and I want to make it clear, the whole board didn't agree with me on this. I think they should lift celibacy. I think that if you advertise yourself, celibate men are welcome and no one else. You're self-selecting people that have problems. Not all of them, but some of them. But if after all, in the Protestant church, many of them marry. We take in people from the Episcopal church, Presbyterian church, who are married and they want to become Catholics. We don't say no. So I think they should lift it. But don't kid yourself, you're going to have a new set of problems.
Yeah. I don't think actually that the problem is that priests can't get married. I think the problem is that the priests who are abusing are, first of all, they have a problem with chastity, not celibacy. They don't have a well-integrated and well-formed human sexuality, and that's why they are using their power to get sex from vulnerable people. If they were well-developed, formed, normal sexual people, whether homosexual or heterosexual or whatever, they would not be abusing minors. So chastity really is the key thing in my view. It's a virtue. And continence, no sex. It's a rule. If you violate it, you should be out.
That question seems to get up to the question, is this about sex or is it about power?
May I?
Both.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the general consensus among people who study this is that sexual abuse is not about sex, it's about power. I think also those same researchers would say that the vast majority of sexual abuse of minors that occurs, at least in the United States, is in a heterosexual context and is in the family, so where you're not dealing with celibacy. And where celibacy might come into play, as the late Richard Sipe argued, because we're dealing with a priesthood that is supposed to be chaste, because we know that they're not always chaste, you have a culture of secrecy. And so the sexual misconduct that we know is happening is covered in secrecy. What happens when things are secret? More secrets are happening. So if you have priests who are having sex with each other or other men, if a priest is going to then have sex with a child, guess what? That's not going to get reported because everybody's got a skeleton in their closet because everyone else is doing things that technically under, the vows that they've taken they shouldn't be doing. And that's how we have the scandal that exploded, because you have bishops who perhaps were not willing to sanction priests who were abusing children because maybe they were doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. And so that culture of secrecy, because there were requirements imposed on the priests to live celibately, the culture of secrecy helped fuel the crisis.
And
One thing that we found, the National Review Board, is the bishops did nothing to prepare these young men to live a life of celibacy. You just can't tell somebody to take 200 showers a week. They let these young men just flounder on this issue, and they often had trouble. They didn't want to tell their mentor about this for fear of being exposed.
Juan Carlos, quick.
And the last thing, this ridiculous myth or that homosexual equals pedophile, that has been completely debunked, but the Vatican occasionally keeps bringing up, is completely stupid. And the research is absolutely to what Nicole says, and it's even in the priest world. There's even priests that abuse kids, but it's a crime of opportunity because that's what they have there, because they live in a very men's world, and there's crimes of opportunity. They're not homosexuals, but they abuse kids. It's been completely proven. So when Benedict and others have said, no homosexuals in the seminary, that's like the worst, and then unconsciously they make you think, okay, homosexuals equals pedophile. That's been completely debunked, and we have to fight against that.
Question.
So I was intrigued by what Mike said about the dissenter, the woman, Marie, who went off the panel, and her argument was that actually the Pope could set up 3 standards and that require everyone in the church to follow those. And I'm just kind of curious if Nicole obviously thinks that would actually be, could the Pope do that? Could he do that and have power? And I would be interested in what other people on the panel thought about that. This seems to me especially important because obviously the U.S. church has been able to at least partially or incompletely self-regulate itself. But in countries where that is much more difficult to do, how much power would the Pope actually be able to say this is the standard and require the widespread different national churches to follow that or not?
He could say it, he could legislate it, but who's going to enforce it? I mean, right, but I mean, even in the US, which is the gold standard, we have a law passed by the Vatican in 2001 that requires every case of that has a semblance of truth. So every allegation that has a semblance of truth has to be sent to the Vatican to be reviewed to determine whether this case should go to a canonical trial or whatever. There is no enforcement of that. The only way we know if there was a semblance of truth to an allegation that didn't get sent is if a victim comes forward to the media and says, hey, I reported this guy and they never reported it. There's no mechanism, there's no auditing of, even in the US, of how cases were handled. Were they sent to Rome? We don't know. That's up to the bishop to decide if this has a semblance of truth. We don't know the cases that didn't get sent. We're seeing in Buffalo now that there were an awful lot of cases that had a semblance of truth that never got dealt with, that never got sent to Rome. So the Pope can legislate up the wazoo, and he doesn't have a police force that's going to be able to go around and enforce it. So Marie Collins rightly says he could have, he promised to create a tribunal to hold the bishops accountable. There was a public statement. I wrote the story. We're going to put a tribunal together to prosecute bishops who are negligent, who do not handle cases well. In the end, the Vatican bureaucracy got to him, and he ditched it and instead passed a law saying we're just going to, handle it internally. And, turns out they have been removing bishops on a kind of ad hoc basis. Every time an allegation comes forward where a bishop has mishandled a case, it does get processed. Bishops are being removed. We're probably going to get the Buffalo bishop removed tomorrow. But the lack of enforcement renders an awful lot of what the Pope can do moot.
I feel a little funny speaking for Marie Collins when she's not here, but I think what she would say is the silence of the Pope sends a message that goes all the way down the line. The Pope's about face on creating a tribunal to hold bishops accountable sends a message that maybe it's okay if bishops don't do their job. That's her point of view, and I think it's another valid point of view. It's okay. It's not just okay. It's essential that reforms happen from the bottom up. But let's face it, this is a hierarchical institution, and the man at the top has to exercise some leadership. That's why he's there.
Yeah.
And also in a very conservative organization like the Church, which is very resistant to change, our legal system has been in place for centuries, and it's very conservative. If you're taking the long view, right, not just the next news cycle, the long view is make legislation, because then you will form new canon lawyers, you will form new bishops, you will form new priests, and they will adapt to the new system. In any kind of legal system, even the civil American legal system, you get a lot of resistance when changes are made. So yes, the Pope can, the Pope should. He's done some of it already. Earlier this year, he issued a very good statement that put the bishops on notice that no more cover-ups and cases will be processed. Is it perfect? I'm an American lawyer. I like open cases and everything out in the open. I don't like confidentiality, but it's a step in the right direction. Again, if you're taking the long view, absolutely legislation is essential.
One of the things that really shocked me, and I'm not as experienced as all these great people that know so much about it, but I was asked, remember the summit in March about abuse, where every president of every bishops' conference in the world had to go, and I was asked to speak there, and I was terrified, so I had to do it via video, which everybody did because, but anyway, so I did it, but I was there. And one of the things that shocked me, and Nicole and I have discussed it, it's the hypocrisy of so many bishops that they made the biggest commitments. We're going to get there. We're going to self-police. We're going to police our colleagues. We're going to police the national. It was incredible. You heard that and you thought, my gosh, the problem is solved. And then they go back to their diocese and they remain exactly the same or even worse because they're covering up even more because they're scared. So it's just, it boggles your mind.
So my question is, how important is it for people to know this? There's been a lot of discussion about it's important to have uncovering. You know, the Pope has said that he wants to have transparency. I mean, but there's no talk about how and when and why did this cover-up, did this secrecy and cover-up start? And the fact is that the last 8 popes, including Pope Francis, have passed canon laws and enforced canon laws that say there can be no talk of any sexual abuse by the clergy under penalty of excommunication. And that's why the 5,000 bishops didn't break line and tell about what they knew about it. It has become a part of their DNA to be secret and so forth. And the Pope has made so many things, he's done so many things that enable people to have, perpetrators to have more freedom, more safety, more feeling like they're not going to get punished because there is so much secrecy and so much cover-up.
What's your question?
My question is, how important is it for people to know this?
I think it's absolutely indispensable for people to know it, and especially for people who have any kind of influence or any kind of voice in their local church to know about this. You know, the bishops will listen to the people who are closest to them, and that very often, unfortunately, means big donors, but it also means parents, their own priests, principals of their schools. I think that that's one thing, honestly, I think it's been lacking in the American church, has been an internal lobby for changes. We've been going along with it, somewhat reluctantly in many cases, but there hasn't been a constituency that's crying out for it inside. And so I think it's all the more important for insiders to know about it and then do something about it.
Survivors need to know what happened to their, you know, what they've, you know, investigated. Have they investigated? Has this man been punished? Have all those who covered up for him, have they been punished? But yet we sometimes know he's been, before they said reduced to the lay state. Now it's, you know, defrocked or whatever. But survivors need to know. It's part of the justice, and it's only fair that survivors know what happened. And that silence is terrible.
Eleanor.
We have a quick two-parter from Facebook. Someone submitted about payouts. With payouts potentially in the billions, could this be the end of the church? And what is the Vatican's response to dioceses seeking bankruptcy protection or hiding behind statutes of limitations?
Good 2 questions. Ed, why don't you?
Let's see, the
payouts issue,
the
yeah.
payouts. The payouts could be massive. There's no question about that. We've seen settlements, global settlements, either through the litigation or through the bankruptcy process that have been gigantic. No diocese that I know of has gone out of business yet. Some of them have been severely financially hurt. You know, as a theological matter, we believe the church will never end until the second coming, of course. But I don't see. I see the payouts to be a potentially massive damage to the institutions, but I don't see the church ceasing to exist. As for what the Vatican thinks, I think the Vatican would prefer if the local bishops deal with their financial matters on their own and keep them out of it. You know, the way the church is structured, of course, the Vatican is every diocese is an independent entity unto itself. We're not like a franchise of the Vatican. So they really have no corporate or financial connection, so there's nothing at stake for the Vatican in the individual diocese.
Look, they've spent so much, so many bishops in the United States, especially where there's a lot more money than the Chilean bishops can't afford anything, but on paying lobbyists and paying PR firms millions of dollars to for these window laws not to happen, and they've spent so much money in that. Frankly, I'm of the opinion that if the church has to go back to the catacombs and we start again, that's perfectly fine.
I have no problem with that.
One more
Can I just say
question?
one quick question
Oh, yeah,
about the
please, go ahead.
statute of limitations? Yes, obviously it was a self-protective move on the part of the church and many other
Your
institutions.
diocese was one that
Ours
paid a
was a
lot
major-
of money
yes.
to lobbyists.
Yes, yes, we did. And the other dioceses here in New York State also did, as did Jewish organizations and other nonprofit groups and school boards and other people, because they're liable also. You have to understand the litigation problem that this creates for a defendant in the case. I'll talk like a lawyer here for a second. There's a reason for the statute of limitations. People die, witnesses die, records are lost, memories are lost. It's very, very difficult for anyone to defend a case where the allegation took place in 1945 and no one else is alive. So that was the reason, the legal reason that the statute of limitations already existed. Yes, of course there was a selfish interest in trying to protect our assets, but everybody, both public and private organizations, had the same incentive.
You did the compensation, the Steinberg.
We did yes, we did. We offered a compensation program to anybody who
compensation
wanted to come
program.
forward.
Was that
Yes.
Seem to have a bit of a problem with the statute of limitations with those programs.
with
No, well, the whole idea was it was intended to compensate people.
yeah.
Limitations with those programs.
Right. The whole
Exactly,
purpose
yeah.
of the program was to compensate people who could make a credible claim that had some evidence behind it that would otherwise have been barred by the statute of limitations. So we paid about, here in the Archdiocese, I don't know about any other diocese, we paid about $65 million to about 350 people. I don't know how many other cases were considered and were found unsubstantiated. I don't know those numbers.
You know, David, at the beginning you asked me what's changed. And I think what we're seeing here is a real cultural shift where, let's say 20 years ago, the benefit of the doubt would have gone to the church, no question about it. And today the benefit of the doubt is, I think, clearly going to the victims and survivors. It's a huge cultural shift.
And they're speaking up. Last question from the audience there. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm from Danbury, Connecticut. We're part of the Bridgeport Diocese. The Hallsberg report came out in October. It was commissioned by the Bridgeport Diocese. And in it, it was claimed that at least 5% of all priests, over the terms of the accusations that they brought forward, of all priests had been credibly accused of sexual abuse. We've talked a lot tonight about the ways that the diocese and the bishops can impact or police or, in whatever way you want to describe, essentially a pseudo-criminal justice system within the United States. And I think the question that I see mostly from community members within my smaller city and within other small towns within areas that are impacted like this is, why are we ceding authority on the way rules need to change, on the way laws need to change to hold people accountable for these acts, to the church that has failed to hold people accountable for these acts? Why are we not focusing our advocacy or focusing our coverage on the responsibility of the states and the federal government, at least in our country, to change the way they're approaching this kind of abuse?
And Pope Francis can change that. In a stroke of a pen, he can write new canon laws. There are canon laws that he hasn't changed that ought to be changed. There's canon law that says bishops have to take every precaution to get the priest to reform. So if you do that, you send him to therapy, you send him to this place and that place, and then you say he's cured, how do you know if he's cured? Send him back
Is there a,
with his kids.
to put it another way, is there some place that's another model for the Catholic Church to follow if some outside secular group?
I think that the manuscript of mine was when Battery died. the Catholic Church would argue that because the way the criminal justice system is organized, when you have survivors who are coming forward 20, 30, 40 years after the crime occurred, that's going to, you're out of luck unless you have a statute of limitations window opening, like we'd have now in New York, New Jersey, California, and some other states. So the church would argue, we're at least going to do what we can. We have a parallel legal system, the canon law system, and yes, we actually have a statute of limitations, but guess what? We're going to waive it because we realize that survivors are out of luck in a lot of ways in the criminal justice system, but at least we're going to do what we can do. So we're going to take the victim's statement. We're going to do what we can do, and within our system, we can take this guy out of ministry, get him away from kids. We're going to put him on penance and prayer. We're going to laicize him. So within its own possibility, within its own canon law system, it will do what it can. Is it enough? Absolutely not. Is the criminal justice system doing enough for these survivors? No, because it's not set up to deal with the fact that, as we now know, the trauma of abuse of children does not come, they don't report it. They don't report it immediately. They don't report it 10 years, 20 years. It takes a lot of time for them to process it. So the criminal justice system is failing them because of statute of limitations. The church is doing, it says, what it can through its own parallel legal system.
You know, we have to, and I think you know where I'm coming from, based on my statements tonight, but we have to be careful because the police in almost any jurisdiction will tell you that most false statements are in the sexual area across the board. And we just have to be very careful. Some young person says, Father so-and-so touched me, I didn't want him to. That may be true, and it may not be true. So that's one thing we have to keep in mind.
A young person would be within the statute of limitations. I want to address the compensation programs because they're done in secret. None of the benefits of going to trial, none of the disclosure, none of the being able to know whether that priest had other victims or not, none of that is allowed out. So the question is, if the Pope does not change the papal secret, which says you're excommunicated if you bring scandal on the church, anything else he says that's below that is still going to encourage the bishops who are actually on the ground making decisions. They are still going to err in the favor of the church and the reputation of the church and clericalism and all of that. So it is a top-down, and the bottom-up has bought into it.
The compensation. Can I just talk about the compensation plans?
And I just want to say one sentence, and I not against you, but it's a common thing. When you say that, you know, it could be true, it could not be true, it's been proven through years and years and years that it's very rare that some person goes and says something false to damage someone. For years, that's been the criticism and the defense of the church and the enemy of the church, and you hate Father so-and-so, and it's been proven in civil society and inside the church that when you speak up about an abuse, it's normally true. It's very rare that it's not, that it's a lie.
Yeah, I just say from our own experience, my own experience working with our investigations and our review board, I would say probably at least 75 or 80% of the cases are found to be substantiated, which means there's enough evidence to reach the standard of proof. The remaining cases, we've had a few false cases. Oddly enough, we have some cases that are provably false, but the person sincerely believes them, which is a problem with memory. The other cases, I think, for the most part, are cases where there just is insufficient evidence to be able to tell. You know, in any process, to be fair, there's a presumption of innocence, and you have to have enough evidence to overcome the presumption of innocence. I don't, every compensation plan, that's how we work with the review board. Every compensation plan has their own standards. I don't know exactly what the standard of proof is or the process is in the compensation plan that you're talking about. In ours, here at the Archdiocese, it was set up to be confidential because we found that most of the victims wanted it that way. Very few of them have come out afterwards. The ones who want to come out. But we didn't feel we had the right or the obligation to publish names of complainants. We eventually published the names of the accused priests. My own practice is I always tell the complainant if the priest had a prior complaint against him.
We're going to have to leave it there. There's so much more we could continue to discuss, and I think this will be a discussion that's going to keep going on. Please join me in thanking our panel.